disgusting that they're sending mothers to prison for 31 months for a social media post, and people with awful pictures of our children, or, you know, masturbating over children in the park, or the likes of Hugh Edwards walk away with suspended sentences. Yep. You know, as a mother, if you said to me, you have to choose, somebody says something really horrible about your child on social media, or they've got some photos of them that you really wouldn't want out there, you know, I know which one I would choose of the two. So it is really frustrating.
Lucy, amazing to be speaking to you today. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Are you?
Yeah, good, thanks. It feels like it's probably been a surreal year or so for yourself in terms of everything that's happened. Um, I suppose we can start from there. How's it been just since coming out of prison? What's life been like?
Yeah, surreal is a good way to put it. I mean, I've actually had a lot of support, and, you know, only positivity come my way, other than, you know, kind of online trolls, which you've got to kind of expect. But yeah, no, it has been surreal. It's been busy. It's been never in a million years did I think, you know, coming out of prison I would have been asked to do as many podcasts and interviews and such like, and comment on political issues that, you know, are kind of relevant to my case and stuff. So yeah, it's very different to how I imagined life coming home would be.
Did you anticipate or have any idea that A, this would potentially happen, and B, that this was happening whilst you were in prison?
In what sense do you mean?
In sense of how almost famous you'd become, how many people knew about who you were,
Yeah, well,
and that sort of stuff.
things changed as I was kind of going through my prison journey, if you like. So obviously, when I first went to prison, obviously in prison you only have access to the mainstream media, BBC, Sky News, that kind of thing. You don't have, you know, your Twitter, your YouTube, you know, alternative medias, podcasts, that kind of thing. So initially, you know, I was public enemy number one. I couldn't turn my TV on in my prison cell without seeing my face all over, you know, Sky News and BBC, you know, Tory councillor's wife, Tory councillor's wife, Tory councillor's wife. Some of the things they were saying about me were just awful. I was just being painted out to be something I'm just not. And that really upset me at the beginning. You know, I had a bit of a breakdown about that, thinking, you know, when I leave here, I'm going to get, you know, accosted in the street and people are going to think I'm this raging racist and da-di-da-di-da. And then as time went on, I think people kind of looked into my story more, looked at other media sources other than the BBC and Sky News, who are very biased, and thought, hang on a minute, this isn't quite as it seems. They haven't quite reported everything as it seems. And I think the turning point for me was my appeal. When my appeal was heard at the High Court, and obviously it was not granted, that's when I started to get like lots of letters in prison, lots of cards in prison, lots of support for people saying, you know, we don't believe anything that's been said about you. We think it's really sad what's happened to you. The country's gone mad. From all over the world, actually, not just the UK. It seemed that everybody was watching my case, that Australia, America, lots of support from Northern Ireland and Ireland, all over. People saying, you know, we're really sorry that's happened to you. Hopefully you'll be reunited with your daughter and your family soon. And I think that was the turning point at which people thought, hang on a minute, this isn't quite how it's been spun here by the mainstream media and the government, etc. And kind of made their own decision. And then, of course, the likes of Alison Pearson and Dan Wootton came on board and started reporting and speaking to my family, and they, you know, spoke the truth as opposed to the narrative. And that's when things changed for me, I think. And then I don't know if you know who Alex Belfield is. He was released from prison around, I think it was like May, June time maybe. Just before me, I was due out in the August, and he took back to his podcast, Voice of Reason, and he had found that a lot of his, you know, kind of supporters and people that followed him were writing to him in prison and sending him cards and stuff, and he said he found it such a comfort. So he then encouraged his, you know, followers he gave out my prison number and where I was, and he encouraged them to write, me letters of support, and it was amazing. I have sacks and sacks and sacks of letters and cards from people that were just, in support of me and saying they're sorry that this has happened to me, and that they, like I said, and which didn't please the prison too much, because obviously all mail has to be checked and photocopied and then given to prisoners. So yeah, it was a bit of a job for them. I think they had full-time people just sorting through my mail towards the end. But of course that was so nice, because I felt like the tide had turned for me massively. I'd gone from, gosh, I'm gonna walk out here and get accosted in the street, to like, actually I'm not public enemy number one, and there were a lot of people on my side. So yeah.
I mean, definitely. I remember I wrote to you, I think it was after the appeal decision, where I saw a lot on X and Twitter, regarding your case, and lots of people speaking out about it. And I remember thinking, wow, this is actually crazy. And I think you were, I think for me and maybe a lot of other people, almost the first, or a really big case where it was, you could really see what was going on in the UK, that there's so many more examples of yourself, and it's getting almost worse and worse. And I remember, I think for a lot of people, you were probably one of the first to really catch the attention, because of how crazy that whole situation is. Have you been able to speak to other people in a similar position to yourself, who have gone through, who are either in prison or going through that process?
Yeah, I have spoken to quite a few people that since I've been released, that found themselves in a similar situation to me. There's Mark Heath, there's Wayne O'Rourke, to name a couple, and then obviously poor Peter Lynch, he never made it out of prison, did he? And I think, weirdly enough, we all had our own experience of prison. I think in some ways I was very lucky. I spent most of my time in Peterborough prison. The girls there were actually lovely. Most of the women were actually, I would have happily let 80% of them out of the front door, and would not have worried that they would be of any danger to anybody in society, you or I, and they literally just needed the right support and the right help. But I think, from what I've been told, there is a problem with Muslim gangs in prison. And of course, these guys were coming in as, as racists. So that didn't go down well. So they perhaps got targeted or had to be moved to wings where, vulnerable persons wings, which aren't a nice place. You're obviously with some not very nice people that have done not very nice things. Whereas I didn't get that reception. At first there was a couple of the women, a couple of the girls that were like, but aren't you a racist? But again, they listened to me. I showed them my paperwork. We got chatting, and then they soon were of the opinion that it was nonsense and that I shouldn't have been there. So I guess in my sense, I was very lucky that I had, lots of support from the people in prison. Both, there was lots of good officers and good women that I was in. I had a few issues when I moved to Drake Hall in Staffordshire for a while. But yeah, overall, I feel that like I was kind of the lucky one, and I had one of the better experiences. I didn't get, beat up by any gangs or constantly accused of being racist or anything like that.
How was it received when you were in prison, and I'm guessing people asked you, what are you here for, when you said it's for a social media post? How was that received by fellow prisoners?
At first, I don't think they believed me. They were like, no. And, there's a bit of an issue in prison where if you've gone in for things that you wouldn't want to admit to because it would, jeopardize your safety, such as, doing awful things to children, those kind of things, very often they'll come up with some story, I'm in here for fraud, I'm in here for this, I'm in here for that. So I think at first they were a bit dubious. They were like, "No, people don't come to prison for writing." They were like, "What did you write? Just that one thing?" Yeah. So the fact that as much as it was awful that I felt like my face was constantly all over the press being smeared and calling every name under the sun, in some ways it helped me because people were able to see that I wasn't lying, that I was telling the truth, that I was in prison for a social media post. Um, I remember a girl in prison that I became really good friends with, and she was a big black girl of African descent. And the first time I met her, she was on my wing, and we were in the garden on exercise, and she kind of clocked who I was and what I was in for, and she says, "So you won't like me then, as you're racist?" And I just kind of laughed, and I went, "Did you come in on a boat?" And she went, "No." I said, "Well, all good then." And then she just laughed, and just like it was that kind of thing. They kind of saw the funny side of it, and she happened to actually be in there for something she shouldn't have been in. And she was NFA'd when she went to court. So she understood that, there were lots of people in prison that shouldn't necessarily be there.
How like frustrating was it for you serving that sentence, especially even probably more so now since you've come out, you see some of the crimes that I think 99% of people would say are far, far worse than what you've done, serving less time than what you were initially sentenced. How, especially now as you reflect back on your time in prison, how frustrating is it for you as a person that you suffered that when there are examples of people suffering a lot less for doing a lot worse things?
I mean, I think people think I'm going to be more angry than I am. I just I think you could get angry about it forever and dwell on it forever. It is what it is. What happened happened. It wasn't ideal by any means, and it is disgusting. It is disgusting that they're sending mothers to prison for 31 months for a social media post, and people with awful pictures of our children, or masturbating over children in the park, or the likes of Hugh Edwards walk away with suspended
Yep.
sentences. As a mother, if you said to me, you have to choose, somebody says something really horrible about your child on social media, or they've got some photos of them that you really wouldn't want out there, I know which one I would choose of the two. So it is really frustrating. But I guess being in prison, you meet lots of other people that you think, these people shouldn't be here either. What's she here? What's this lady doing here? What are we actually achieving? This is what you have to ask yourself. Anybody has to ask themselves, what are we achieving by sending anyone to prison? Do you really believe, does anyone really believe that I was ever a danger to the public? I don't think they
Yeah.
do. And that's what we have to ask ourselves about anybody that we're dishing out prison sentences to. Is it in the public interest, in the both the purse, we're paying for this. Is this the way forward? Is it the best way to deal with this person? Do they actually just need help? Do they need counselling? Do they need rehab? Do they need housing? All of these things, instead of taking the easy option out. And also in my sentence, I feel was a deterrent for other people. This is what we're going to do to her because she said something awful online that we don't like. So we will do the same to you. And I think for quite a long time it worked. People were really careful about what they were putting online. I know that a lot of my friends that have the same sense of humour and stuff as me were really worried about getting that knock on the door for a long time. But I think that's kind of tailed off now, and people have, I'm back on Twitter now, and I look at some of the things people put, and I'm like that. Oh, I think it worked for a short period, but people are too frustrated to just shut up, and I think now they've just gone back to, do you know what? I'm not going to shut up. I'm not going to be silenced. I'm not going to have my free speech taken away from me. That's what I've noticed anyway.
No, definitely. I think likewise for myself, what I look on X and on other platforms as well, I definitely don't see people being as scared as maybe when initially your sentencing was happening, and so it definitely seems to people are just so frustrated and angry at what's going on, and it's scary when you see that the UK is the #1 country for most social media arrests, and it's
Oh gosh,
frightening when we.
statistics are crazy, aren't they? And when you look at it, you know, it's supposed to be China, Russia, those kind of states that are supposed to be communist states, yet we've got the highest arrest for social media posts and non-crime, hate crime, whatever they call
Yeah.
it these days. And again, I'm not saying that what I said was okay. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is we need to be looking at whether was it really a good use of time and money to send me to prison. No, it wasn't.
I mean, when just going back to when this all happened, when the arrest happened and all this stuff, were you in disbelief? Like, did you like, I'm just trying to think about how I'd be in that position, and I think I'd just be like, is this a prank or something? Like, how were you when the police came knocking? What was going through your head? How, like, what actually happened?
Unfortunately, I didn't think it was a prank. I was almost expecting them. I mean, I
Oh wow.
didn't for 1 minute expect to be charged and you know, and remanded. I thought the police would just come round, give me a slap on the wrist, tell me off, frighten me a bit, make me think, you know, better not, you know, you need to watch what you put on social media, etc. That's what I was expecting. And obviously, I was arrested once, bailed with conditions not to post on social media, and released. And I thought that was going to be the end of it, to be honest, because on the Tuesday they were like, "There's not enough evidence to bring charges. You're bailed pending further investigation." And nothing had changed in between the Tuesday and the Friday that I was actually charged and arrested, other than kind of the narrative, things that were going on with the system and the government and all that kind of thing. And obviously, Keir Starmer made his speech, you know, telling the police and the judges to go hard on the likes of me. That's the only thing that I can think had changed in between that time. Do I really believe that the police thought it was a good use of their time? No, I don't think they did. But I think they were forced, if you like, by from powers of be to act upon what they were being told. I don't think they were comfortable arresting the likes of me. I don't think they thought it was a good use of their time, but I just think they were doing as they were told. I'd like to hope that that was the case anyway. And
Yeah.
yeah, I was just in utter shock when they charged me. I didn't say anything. I was just like, this cannot be happening. People like me don't get arrested and charged. You know, like what? I was extremely anxious and upset. I wasn't really functioning as, you know, as I normally would. I just couldn't quite. I was just in utter shock.
I just, yeah, just trying to like even remotely relate it just seems absolutely crazy what you experienced during that period. I mean, one of the things I wanted to ask, just prior to the arrest and prior to all of that happening is when people had mentioned on whether it's BBC, Sky, wherever, that you were married to a Tory councillor, Conservative councillor, it made me think about local politics in general, because my dad was a councillor quite some time ago, and also a Conservative councillor, and I remember how dirty local politics was, and I had it towards me being quite vocal in support of my dad, or like often on X, Instagram. And I remember, and now I have a lot more followers and I have a lot more of a platform, but I would argue the abuse I would get on a local level was far worse than the general public, even despite having more followers then than just being a kid and just supporting his dad. I just the levels of stuff that went on locally in terms of how catty and how really people can hold on to things and really want to push it out, I've never seen before. And I remember when I kept seeing that, I remember thinking, I wonder if that's played a part in your arrest, or have people in the this may sound crazy to other people, but I know for a fact in local politics, people will make stories and cases, and they will send that stuff to police and other authorities. And that's what I've seen it myself, and I wouldn't be remotely surprised if that's something happened to you. Did any of that have a play on what you think
Oh,
happened to you?
Massively, I think. So, you only have to look at the reports that were being made about me by the mainstream media. They could never ever, the likes of the BBC and Sky News, never ever just said Lucy Connolly, wife, mother, childminder, Lucy Connolly. It was always Tory councillor's wife, Lucy Connolly. And Ray had a lot of backlash from, like you said, local politics is horrible. Like,
Yeah.
I always used to think that, MPs and stuff had it bad, but actually I think you're right. I think that because local level politicians, they have a lot less protection than the MPs that sit in Parliament and that the likes. So instantly, people that voted differently to Ray attacked him, demanded that he stood down from his role. There was a group of 15, I think it was, anonymous people, they wouldn't name themselves. I think there were Labour councillors, Labour MPs that wrote to the council and said that Ray, had not followed conduct because he was supporting me. And there was a big investigation, and the investigation found that he said and done absolutely nothing wrong. And any support that he had, voiced for me was in his capacity as my husband, not his capacity as a councillor. People demanding that he step down because of what I'd said. There's a lady, I'm going to say her name actually, Wendy Randall. She's a councillor for the Labour Party in Northampton. She was saying he needs to rein his wife in, and I was like, firstly, I don't care who does or doesn't believe it. Ray knew nothing about that tweet until the aftermath. I had to fess up. I said, oh gosh, I wrote this tweet, I deleted it, and now it's all blown up and they're coming after you. And he was just like, oh great, And then he was going, just chill out, don't go back on Twitter. The police aren't coming for you, you're not worth their time. And all of this. And yeah, he had a massive backlash, as in, he also had a lot of support on the streets. He's the local councillor for this area, and he grew up around here. So everybody knows the real Raymond. Everybody knows the real me. They know we're not these people that the media are portraying us to be. So he did have a lot of support, but obviously people jumped on that bandwagon of, oh, we don't like the Tories, she's a Tory councillor's wife. The things that we saw and read were quite funny, actually. So he got massively attacked. People used it as an excuse to bring their political bias into the situation. So, even if deep down I don't think they think that I deserved this or Ray deserved it, and all everything that was going on, I just think that they're so blindsided by politics. They used it as an excuse to divide people when it comes to politics, and this is the difference between someone like me and someone like them and someone like Ray. If I think something's wrong, I think it's wrong. I don't care who you vote for. I'm going to voice my opinion that it's wrong. If the Reform Party came out and said and did something that really offended me tomorrow, I would happily stand up and say that, I'm annoyed with that or what have you, because, and that's what I find with and I guess it's in some ways it's a clever move for them, because they kind of all stick together when they don't, the left, so to speak, and they don't slag off their own people and their own governments and stuff, whereas somebody in the centre or right maybe would be quite critical of the governments or their leaders or their councillors if they didn't agree with what was going on. So yeah, in essence, whilst we also had a lot of support in the very beginning, people jumped on that bandwagon and were like, Councillor Connolly needs to resign. And obviously the Labour people around here were very angry. He took their seat.
Yep.
And he was doing really well. He's a good councillor. He's a diligent councillor. He's known by everybody. And he was doing really well, as in, he was getting things done. And weirdly enough, even though it suits the community and the people that voted him in for him to get stuff done, the people, whose seat he took, they didn't like that. They're not really interested in the good of the people. They're interested in themselves. Politics is, like you said, is a nasty business.
And I can totally understand and see what you're saying, because just speaking on my experience and my dad's experience, it's exactly the same. People, and that was more Lib Dems in where I lived, but it's essentially the same. The Labour would never even have a seat in Windsor Maiden; that they just don't exist. So a lot of them end up becoming for Lib Dems effectively the same. And I just the nastiness was really something I didn't expect, like screenshotting tweets and putting them into like Facebook groups, and it always felt very organised. These attack,
Yeah,
almost like
and that's
mobs, and
exactly what happened here. There were people with WhatsApp groups, and we saw people. They saw people on social media saying, "Well, that we've had that in our Labour WhatsApp group. What? Why have you got my tweet in your Labour WhatsApp group?" I mean, I laugh because these people have just got an awful lot of time on their hands, haven't they, to be worrying about other people and what other people are doing. Um, yeah, it definitely had, and I hear people say now, well, why does she get so much attention, or and XYZ doesn't, and they were sent to prison too, and she only gets the attention and the press interest she gets because she's married to a Tory councillor. But you can spin that the other way, can't you?
yeah.
I don't think I would have got as much negative media and attention had I not have been married to a Tory councillor. So it kind of works both ways. It didn't go in my favour that I was married to a Tory councillor. In fact, quite the opposite.
You could argue, I don't know this well enough, but you could argue if you weren't married to a Tory councillor, you may never have even gone to jail. You may have never have got this much attention.
My probation worker, my OMU worker in prison used to say that. Let's be honest, Lucy, you're only here because of who you're married to.
Yeah.
A lot of people are of that opinion. I mean, and we only have to look at the councillor Ricky Jones. Now, I know people will argue and they will say,
Yeah.
yes, but he didn't plead guilty. No, you're right. He didn't plead guilty. You're absolutely right. I pled guilty. He pled not guilty. But he had the advantage of being out on bail to be able to plead not guilty. I was remanded. I'd had 2 bail applications turned down, and they were not going to let me have bail. They'd made that quite, as far as I'm concerned, they unlawfully remanded me. They had no grounds to not grant me bail. But Ricky Jones was able to get bail. And that has a big bearing on the way people plead. I met people in prison that had been on remands a good 12 months. There was a good chance that if I went not guilty and risked it and went to jury, yes, there's a good chance I would have been acquitted, but there's always that chance that you're found guilty and then you lose your credit. And then how long are you waiting for that trial in the first place? So if I'd have been waiting 15 months, say, for a trial, that's longer than what I served.
Right.
So I had to weigh up my options and say to myself, right, it's quite apparent here that they're wanting me to go down. They're not playing fair. They're not playing by the book. What is the quickest route home to my child? Do I want to go not guilty because I don't feel like I was guilty of inciting violence and it was an emotional outburst, albeit not okay, but it was never in my intention for people to actually take to the streets and start rioting outside hotels, and that's not something I've ever advocated for. I had to make that decision. I was already in prison. They weren't letting me out. I didn't get bail. So at that point, I just had to decide what my quickest route was. I had a judge sitting there telling me before she'd seen any kind of psychiatric evidence, before she'd heard any of mitigate, before she'd heard anything, telling me in court that I would be serving a substantial custodial sentence.
Wow.
They'd made that quite clear from day one. I knew I was getting a custodial sentence and there was nothing I could do about that. The pre-sentence report that the courts asked probation to write, the recommendation was to get me out of custody as soon as possible and get me back with my daughter. And there were better ways of dealing with me, such as community service, counselling, all that kind of stuff. 9 times out of 10, a judge will go with probation's recommendations, which is why they asked them to write the pre-sentence report in the first place. And it's recorded in my pre-sentence report. I've said to the probation officer, this is a waste of time. It doesn't matter what you say. They're sending me to jail. And she was like, well, you don't know that. And I said, I do, because they've made that quite clear.
Mm.
Um, and that's what happened, you know. And people say that the sentencing was in the guidelines. No, it wasn't. You know, the minimum, the starting point for a Cat A, which I shouldn't have been charged on anyway, was 3 years. Take off your credit plus mitigation, you would be looking at around 2 years, which is what my solicitor originally said. But he then said, well, had you been found guilty in a trial, you would have got 4.5 years. So that's what I'm starting at. Then
Right.
I'm going to take off your 25% credit. So actually, prison sentence wise, it was of no value to me to go guilty, because I didn't really gain anything. I served the same amount of time had I've gone to trial and been found guilty, but we all know there's a massive chance that I would have been acquitted, because there were everybody that went not guilty did get acquitted actually within seconds. There was one case, wasn't there, Jamie, I can't remember his surname, was it like 17 seconds or something silly
Yeah.
the jury took to decide that he wasn't guilty. So we all know had I gone to court, but you know, hindsight's a great thing, and it's not going to do me any favors to look back and think, why didn't I? Why didn't I? Why didn't I? And people question me all the time. Well, you are guilty because you weren't guilty. You know you're guilty. Well, I am guilty of writing that tweet. Yes, you're right. But I'm not guilty of wanting, you know, to incite violence, and I'm not a racist. I am, you know, just at the end of my tether, as everyone is with the state of the country. I'm upset about the levels of illegal immigration. I'm upset that these people, you know, are walking the streets with my child, and I went about it the wrong way. And you know, and I've never said otherwise. But again, I've never agreed to my solicitor or otherwise that it was my intention to incite violence or racism. That's I've never agreed to that, and I made that quite clear to my solicitor from the outset. But unfortunately, I was put in a position where I just felt that I had to make a call for the you know, basically for the sake of my family. What was the quickest way back to them?
I think you've answered, well, you definitely answered a question I had coming up for you, and maybe a lot of other people who thought the same thing of you pleading guilty at the time um, when obviously a lot of people were saying there's nothing guilty about it in that sense. I think you've answered a lot of people's questions. I mean, when you took that plea and that happened, what was again your feeling? Because obviously you can tell you don't feel that, and it must have been hard. What I'm trying to say is to make that plea when you know it's the best thing to do for maybe for your family in terms of the short. But how was it emotionally, in the sense of you're pleading to guilty is probably something that, well, we all know is you shouldn't have to.
It was awful, because obviously, again, I didn't have the hindsight of being able to sit round a table with a good legal team. Ray was already speaking to Adam King, the barrister, at the time, and he was of the opinion that I shouldn't go guilty, and for these reasons. And I remember being in Peterborough on a visit, and Ray and I had a blazing row, because he was saying to me, please do not go guilty, Lucy. You are not this person you're being made out to. Please don't go guilty. Adam says X, Y, Z. This is not incitement, da 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 da. And I just lost my shit, for want of a better word. And I said, but it's all right for you to say that, because you're not the one sitting where I am. You're not the one that's been remanded in jail, not knowing when she's coming home. So yeah, I mean, people have their opinions, don't they, on what they would have done in my situation. But the reality of it is, you don't know what you would do until you're in that situation.
100%. And I think more than that story of pleading guilty or not guilty, I think the fact that you ended up there in the first place on the basis of what you did is the main story here. I think that's what most people, when they talk about you, it's always how on earth were you even at that stage where you got arrested, where you had to go to prison in the first place. I think that's the really worrying thing. You mentioned it there about Keir Starmer's stay and what's going on in the UK. How worried are you at the moment of what's going on? Because you would have gone to prison, you'll be well aware of having serving that sentence or some of the issues. Now you've come out and you've probably, I mean, I suppose that's a question. Are you surprised? Are you even more worried than before you went to prison about what's going on in the UK?
Definitely. Like, I knew the country was in a mess, but having seen the state of the prison system, the judiciary, having met some of the women that are in the system, it's even worse than you could ever imagine. And it's, let's face it, it's not getting any better. And listen, all politicians have their faults, don't they? There's good and bad in every political party. And this is for my reason why I've kind of picked my team and I'm going to stick with reform, because I truly believe, yeah, they're not going to make the right decision every time, but they are our last chance in the UK. They are our last chance to turn things around and get some kind of normality back and start putting people of the UK first, because you know what? There's nothing wrong with that.
Mm.
Why can't we say, okay, well, house all these people that are coming here illegally, because it's our, if you agree that that is our duty to do. I mean, I don't agree, but a lot of people would. But why can't we house, you know, all these other people on the street? Homelessness is such a catalyst for crime and all of these things, drugs. You know, people use these things as a crutch to get through being homeless, living on the street. They resort to crime. And if we fix, just for example, the homeless crisis in this country, we'd be fixing a lot of things. But it's like they don't want to.
Yeah.
Like, there is nothing wrong with being white. There's nothing wrong with putting your own people first. There's nothing wrong with being British born. You know, none of us should have to apologise for being who we are. You shouldn't have to apologise for being Asian. I shouldn't have to apologise for being white. You should never have to apologise for whatever religions you choose. None of us should ever have to do that. But it feels like we do in the UK. It feels like my child, our children really are at the bottom of the pecking order. And the way I look at it is like, we do okay. You know, me and myself, my husband, he's got a good job. We have a home. Yeah, we could have a bigger house, but couldn't we all? We have an okay life, you know, financially we're okay. We've kind of built our life, if you like. But I look at my daughter now and I think, Jesus Christ, what is she actually going to do? If she left school and went and got a normal job paying, you know, 25 grand in an office, there's no way she can live off that. She could never, unless we are in a position to help her. She's not going to be able to build buy a house. She's not, you know, she'll be living at home forever, or, you know, and it's really sad that the government seem to take this stance that our children should come last.
It's
And I
bizarre.
think the Southport massacre, it just proves that our children just aren't important to them. And I happen to think they're our future, and that we should be doing everything in our power to ensure that their futures, you know, they've got prospects. You know, the country's in massive debt. We're not going to be paying for that. They're going to be paying for that. Their children are going to be paying for that. All of these things, you know, I wouldn't want to be young now, would you? Like trying to get on the property ladder and find a job. You know, I walked straight out of school and into a bank on an apprenticeship. That's just not available to people anymore. I just think we could do with going like full circle and going back to the 90s. That would do me. And, you know, and this is why I think that if reform don't get in, this is just my opinion, we are not going to be able to turn this around. And, you know, yes, they're not perfect, but I don't think they'd have us living under the kind of the regime and the dictatorship that we seem to find ourselves living under now. And if they don't get in, I won't be staying in the UK to find us. I'll be taking my family and going elsewhere.
I mean, I think there's so much of what you said there so many people agree with. I mean, when you talk about British kids, in particular, white children in the UK, I did this recently on the BBC where unfortunately I was shouted at throughout most of the interview, but I gave clear stats. These are all factual stats about how, in particular, white boys do worse than white girls, but still, it's generally they're not both not in a good position, both similar. And the numeracy and literacy rates for British white boys is the lowest amongst every ethnic group. So that includes Indian, Chinese, black, or whatever, British white boys. And I said that's terrifying because they will make up most of the employment, the majority of the country, but we'll never hear anything about that stat, which should terrify everyone. They're not going to have maternity leave at any period, that they're going to be working for the longest period, and the fact that they're not, I think we should all be really worried and scared. And then also they're taught at school to apologize for every sin that's happened over the last 100, 200, whatever years, and
I'm not a
the
fan of the
confidence
state
must be
school
so
system.
low. The confidence
No,
must be so
I
low, even
mean,
for like
yeah,
your children. And how I mean, it's a good, I suppose, a question for you. I mean, the how much how are children supposed to have any confidence or any belief in themselves if they're constantly talked about all the bad stuff Britain's done? And Britain, I keep saying this to everyone, it's the only country, or the Europe and US maybe, are the only countries, the West, that do this. No other country in the world, China, Africa, Asia, no one sits there and talks down their country as much as we do. Why do you think that is? And do you see that with your child?
I mean, I try and keep her out of politics as much as possible, and this is the thing. I really believe that our children should be allowed to be children, and I'm not down with all this, trans stuff that's pushed onto them, all this, do you know if you're a boy or a girl, or this, children are children, and they're inquisitive, and when they're 4 years old, they might dress as Batman one day and Cinderella the next. It doesn't make them trans, or it doesn't make them confused about what they wish to be. And my daughter tells me stories about school. Oh, do you know there's this room and where you can go if you, and I just think, Jesus Christ. And she comes back and she says stuff, and I said, what? The teacher said that, yeah.
Wow.
And I just think, I mean, it was interesting, wasn't it? I don't know if you saw, there was a poll recently, and it said that, it just confirmed what we already knew, that most teachers are left leaning, and the majority of teachers in this poll are going to be voting the Green Party. Now, that's no surprise to me, and I don't have an issue with that. I really don't. You're entitled to your political views. But what I do have an issue with, and I used to tell this to my daughter's school all the time, you don't have to like her, you don't have to like me, you don't have to like what I stand for, but you do have to teach her like you do any other child, and not bring your prejudice and your politics into school. And unfortunately, I don't believe that is the case anymore. I don't believe that schools are leaving the politics outside the front door.
Yep.
And it's always worried me, thinking, I never had this at primary school because they were amazing, but when she started secondary school, I was always thinking, they're well aware that, Ray is a Conservative councillor in this area. Are the teachers going to target her because, our politics don't align with theirs? There is always that worry, I think. And I'm not the only person to say that. There is a reason why MPs and stuff generally send their children to private schools, and they don't feel that they would kind of be a good fit in state schools. And I just think schools have just lost the plot now with what they are allowed to teach children, what they're not allowed to teach children, what the paperwork, this PHSE and all of this stuff. It's not your business to be teaching my children about this. I'll teach them that, and I'll decide when they're ready. Because I think we forget. I think children are a lot less prejudiced than us. Yes, they say what they see, yeah. and as they say, out of the mouths of babes, but I remember my daughter, when she was about 7, trying to describe a little boy that she wanted to. I said, why, if you're not inviting the little boy that you saw in Audi car park the other day and he gave you a Magnum? She was like, what's that, mummy? And I was like, she was like, is he a little bit brown? You and I would say, oh, they're Asian. Like, this is the first thing you would do. Children don't see it. They generally do not see that. They're just their friends, aren't they?
Yeah.
So I think we're pushing this onto children. They don't need to know this stuff. Children are children, and yeah, they can be mean and they can be cruel, but they don't see the things that adults see. They're very, blind to it all. And it's that saying that no child is born racist, isn't it? And that's true. Why would they? Racism doesn't come into their radar as a child unless they're taught it. just like I don't want my child thinking it's completely normal to decide your sex these days, and that's just my opinion, and I get that, but I just think schools crossed the line now, and we are left in a position where we're doubting whether we should be sending our children into school or not. There's a reason homeschooling is on the up massively.
I mean, definitely. I think so many people listening to this will 100% agree with you. And we've had so many people on here saying the teachers are almost becoming like parents. They're doing the role of what a parent should do. And I don't know enough in particular on this subject, but people are saying maybe a lot of these teachers don't actually have children themselves. So then they end up using these students as their own children. And it's like, that's not the right thing to do. And they just seem to be growing their role. Do you think that's almost reflective of Labour in some ways, where they just seem to want all, instead of giving personal accountability, instead of saying, Lucy's the mum and empowering you to make bold decisions and you to go forward, instead they want to make all the decisions, and they're the like an authoritarian dictatorship regime, and that's what they're trying to do.
100%. I'm always shouting at the radio, when I'm done. I don't need you to feed my child. I don't need you to tell me to my child to clean its teeth. I don't need you, and I don't, And there was a thing on yesterday about the latest thing is about speech, isn't it? And giving children tablets and screen time, and it's having a negative impact on their speech, and children are going to school not being able to speak. Now, whilst I agree that too much screen time is not good, and there probably is a lot of evidence to suggest that it hinders their learning and their speech and stuff. I'm not debating that. That's as a parent, if you're sending your 4-year-old, 5-year-old to school that, can't speak, is still in nappies, that isn't the state's problem. That's your fault as a parent, My child could speak at 18 months old because she watched YouTube, eggs on the phone, and people making stuff out of Play-Doh all the time. But I also read to her a lot. So we went to music groups, she was interacted with a lot. She wasn't just plonked in front of a screen. And also, let's not forget, women or parents now are expected to work like they don't have children and parent like they don't work. They've put everybody in a position now where it's not viable for just one person to work. You can't live off one person's salary unless you're on a really, really good salary. You're a mother, you've gone out, you've left the house at 8 o'clock, you've come back at 6 o'clock, you've now got to do dinner and bath time and bedtime and homework and all of those things. And you've got a 2-year-old that's getting under your feet. Do you really blame them for putting them in front of the telly or the tablet while you're doing dinner, while you're sorting the older children out and all that? I think we're very judgmental in that sense, and I think that the government can be, not just this government but previous governments are to blame for putting families in a position where they do both have to work full time just to pay the bills and not have a great family life. And I do think children are very different to kind of how you and I grew up, but I was lucky enough to have my mum at home full time bringing me up. My child was lucky enough to have me, but who's actually parenting these children now? Because these parents have to work, minimum 9 to 5. And that's not a judgment, that's just a fact, So I think there's so much to unpack there, as in, yes, it is your fault if your child doesn't have additional needs, etc., and you're sending them to school and they can't count and they can't talk. And my kids, when she went to school, she knew all her shapes, all her colours, she could write her name. Now, I'm well aware that isn't, all children are different. I was a childminder for a long time.
Right.
And whilst I minded, I would happily let them watch telly after school as well, but I took them to music groups. Like I said, I read to them. I potty trained them all with their parents at around 18 months old. It is lazy parenting. And the more you feed this, the more you're giving these parents an opportunity to do that. Oh, I don't have to brush my children's teeth because someone else is going to do it. Oh, I don't have to give my child breakfast in the morning because I can pack them off to school and someone else is going to feed them. No, that's your job. Don't have them then. If you can't be bothered to look after them, don't have them.
Do you? I want to speak out your experiences with maybe younger people in prison. Do you think Did you meet many younger female prisoners, and B, do you think that some of that is just down to poor parenting from young age?
No, from my experience, a lot of the young girls I met in prison were kind of very vulnerable, perhaps
Okay.
been in care, um, didn't have the best start in life. Um, Most of it was drug related. They were probably running drugs for bigger drug dealers, and it actually really infuriates me because you've got these young girls that are vulnerable, that somebody's come up to them, probably a man, to be honest, and said, you do this for me, you sell me these drugs, and they promised them the earth.
Yeah.
And these girls have never had a lot in their life. They're vulnerable. They don't have decent families. So it kind of gives them a sense of purpose and a sense of community.
Yeah.
And they're promised the world. And all of a sudden they've got some money in their pocket and they're wearing designer clothes and designer trainers. And then they get caught. They get caught, running drugs for these people.
Yeah.
And the sad thing is, the police, again, they're picking up the wrong people. So they're arresting these young girls, giving them up. Some of these people I'm meeting were getting up to 10 years in prison for,
Wow.
for drugs, for selling drugs. And they were putting them down, as lead roles. They are not lead roles. They are young, vulnerable kids that have been sucked in by, some massive coke dealer that's bringing it into the country and is recruiting young, vulnerable children and girls to run their drugs for them. So, and I saw it regularly. Oh, yes, the police giving themselves a pat on the back. We've busted this drugs ring and this £1 million drugs ring, which actually isn't a lot in the grand scheme of things when we're talking about drugs. And, we've arrested this girl and she's got 5 years in prison. And I just think, well done you. What about the people that are actually bringing it into the country and have another 10 girls that are running for them, and for every one you put inside, they'll just recruit another. And it goes back to this kind of low-hanging fruit. I feel like sometimes the police are going for the easy option. It's easy to arrest and lock up the young, vulnerable girl that's running their drugs, that won't rat them out. There's no way they're going to rat these people out. They'd be stupid to. They know that. And meanwhile, the big guns are still on the street, selling to vulnerable people and recruiting young kids. So, yeah, in my experience, again, a lot of the girls, it was drugs, or you rarely meet anybody in prison without a story to tell, and it's usually pretty tragic. And when you hear their story, you look at them and think, well, it's no wonder you ended up in here, to be honest.
Right.
And I mothered a lot of the young ones in prison. I ended up taking quite a few of them under my wing. And there was one girl, long story short, I became quite friends with her. She was only 19 when she first came in. Unbeknown to her, she was pregnant, ended up
Wow.
in prison pregnant. And, she just needed her mum. She'd had a shit life, trauma on another level. So again, yeah, she shouldn't have done what she did. She knows that, and she's done her time. But again, if she hadn't have gone through the trauma that she'd gone through, I'm quite confident that she wouldn't have ended up in that situation in the first place. Again, so we're not helping people in the right way. We could have prevented her ending up in prison if she'd have got the right diagnosis for stuff, if she'd have got the right help, the right support, but she didn't. And there are millions and millions of people out there that are crying out for help, crying out for housing. A lot of people don't want you to just give them benefits and that's that. That's that. A lot of people do want to work. A lot of people do want a purpose in life. So why aren't we helping them to do that? It is really sad, really, really sad. I've met people in prison that were put there for their own safety, for want of a better word, bollocks. It's just an easy option. Nobody can be bothered to deal with them or give them the right support they need. So they throw them in jail because it's just the easiest option. And it's not cheap to house somebody in jail. It's around £55,000 a year to the taxpayer to put somebody in jail, and that's a minimum. Would it not be cheaper just to house these people, run rehabilitation programs for them, help them with programs that are going to get them a job and give them a purpose? Would that not be a better use of time and money?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. It just seems as if this government, and you could argue previous, is, I don't, like you say earlier, I don't think they had the interests of British people at heart, which is just bizarre when no one else in the world would govern like this. It just feels as if you're a British person in particular, why you're not going to get the same treatment as somebody else. And I think that's horrible. I think most people would agree it's just wrong.
And it's not even hearsay, is it?
Mm.
There's facts out there to back up what we're saying. It's just everything just feels so broken. And I know in lots of ways we are very lucky in the UK, you know, for lots of reasons. But I think from my point of view as a mother, that's where I worry, because I just think it's the future's looking pretty bleak for our kids right now, and I don't know how to fix that. Can it be fixed? I don't know what to do. I feel quite helpless.
Coming, using the prison experience that you've had, would being involved in prison reforms be something you would potentially be interested or are interested in looking into doing?
I would love nothing more than to be involved in prison reform, because actually I don't think it's that hard. I think it's actually quite simple. And I would love to work with the next government to implement changes. And I always say, like, I spoke to these girls and these women in prison, and a lot of them can't articulate themselves very well. So they do get, mouthy and aggy and stuff like that, because they're not like you or I. They only know one way of, articulate themselves. And they don't really have a voice. People just look at them as they're just criminals, they're just trouble. They're not. Most of them are really not like that at all. And I'm not going to lie, I was that person before I went to prison. Well, they're in prison. They've obviously done something really bad to end up in prison. I wouldn't have had much sympathy for them. But, then I went to prison, and then I met all these other people that I felt shouldn't have been in prison, and I looked at it differently. So I'm the first one to put my hand up and say, I didn't always, have these views. So I, unfortunately, whatever way you look at it, had an insight into a system that unfortunately, most people don't get an insight into. So yeah, I would love to be involved in prison reform, and I used to say to the girls all the time, because they did make me laugh. I think they thought I actually had some influence or something, because obviously they were like constantly, "What, you've been on the telly again, Lucy? You on the telly again? Look!" They used to see the letters that come in and stuff. They just were quite intrigued, I think, and they used to say to me, "Oh, you're the MP's wife." I was like, no, I'm not married to an MP. And in the end, I just rolled with it, because I was just so sick of explaining the difference between. And because of the way the media had painted me, and the amount of time that my mug was on the telly, I honestly thought they thought I was somebody, not this little, wife and mum that lived in my 3-bed semi in Northampton. And sometimes it was hard to explain to them that I really don't have any influence, and I just made a promise to them that when I left there, I would do my absolute best to give them a voice and try my hardest to make, implement changes in the system, even if it's only small changes that help them. I might not be able to do that. I mean, I'm sure better people than me have tried, but I'm prepared to die trying, because I do feel really passionate about the fact that it's a failing system. We're massively failing people, and if we can help one set of people, why can't we help everybody? It's not about money. It's not about money, because it costs money to put people in prison. It's about, I don't know, what is the problem? Why can't they not be bothered? The way I see it is these people aren't important to them.
Yep,
The way
agreed.
I see it now is our children aren't important to the government. The likes of most of the people in prison aren't important to the government. So you can understand why people are getting frustrated when they see people that aren't working, earning the
Yep.
same amount of money as them. People that haven't got a legal right to be in the country, being housed with mobile phones and 3 square meals a day, when families that are working full time are visiting food banks.
Yeah.
Surely the government can understand why people are frustrated.
Yeah, I mean, it, I think they're just so out of touch with the reality, and for so many people, it almost,
That's
as
exactly
bad
it.
as it sounds, it's almost better for them to be on benefits than to work. And how in any country does that make sense? Like, how is it? It should never be
It-
better for you not to work than to work. But it seems like in the UK right now, it's almost better if you don't. And I think that's such a horrible, bad place to be. And when you again,
It's
when
just another system that's broken. It's just another
yeah.
part of the system that's broken, and it feels very overwhelming right now, doesn't it? That we think,
Yeah.
gosh, we feel like we've got so much to fix. How are we going to fix it? How are we going to do this?
Do you think one of the positives of prison experience is this sort of new, renewed, almost effort from yourself to try and get involved in these things? You know, you now have such incredible experience with prisons and the things that you could do prison reform, I'm sure be incredible. You've also somebody when people, I honestly think when people say your name in 10, 20 years, it will always be, oh, wow, like we can't make sure that never happens again in terms of freedom of speech and all that sort of stuff. So have you almost had like a renewed sense of purpose since coming out of prison?
Yeah, I think so. And people say to me, like, as awful as what happened to you was, maybe it happened for a reason. I'm not a massive believer in this whole everything happens for a reason, you know. There's some things that should just never happen. Um,
Mm.
but maybe, I do wonder. I mean, Alex and I laugh sometimes, and we're having a conversation, Alex, and he says it makes you wonder why on earth they would have wanted to given the likes of you and I an insight into the prison system because it's not good. So, you know, they might have known we're going to come out shouting about how shit the system is and how shit the government are and, you know, like, and how failing the system is. So it it makes me smile sometimes and I think I can't believe you bunged someone like me in prison. You know, I used to run workshops, you know, with these women. Literally, they'd be like, Lucy, can you write this letter for me? Can you write this complaint for me? And they'd all be sitting around me and we'd all be like writing writing the complaints and writing letters for them because like I said, through no fault of their own, they're not, you know, some of these ladies can't read and write. So
Wow.
they don't know how to write a complaint and go about things the right way. So I'd like to think that whilst I was in prison, I was very humble and I treated everybody with the same respect. I never at any point, you know, judged these women or felt I was better than them. And I would like to think that I made a difference to some of their lives because I do believe that I did. So if some good came out of it, you know, then great.
How was your husband during this process? Because, you know, obviously not connected directly with what happened, but in some ways is because constant Tory councillor being the first thing that somebody says is the wife of the Tory councillor, and I can't imagine the grief he would have got locally. How has he been able to cope? I suppose just before you went to prison, when the arrest and stuff happened, and then when you were actually in prison.
I think it had a massive detrimental effect on him, and he was very lucky locally because um, most of the councillors and people did support him, you know, and he'll tell you it's quite funny. The only people he's ever had any issue with is white it's white people, you know. He remembers his friends. There's quite a big Bangladeshi community in Northampton, and there's quite a few councillors that are Bangladeshi, and you know, they were the first ones to come up to him and say, Ray, we know this is all rubbish. We know you're not this person. We've got your back. If you need anything, you know, and a couple of them have got restaurants. You come to our restaurants. You know, they were so kind and still are. So I think at first he was really nervous to, you know, go into council meetings and, you know, worried about what people thought of him. But it was quite clear quite early on that, you know, the majority knew that this was nonsense and that he was none of these things and he was not a racist and his wife was not a racist and you know they knew Ray and they knew well and you know anybody with any sense takes somebody at face value, don't they? I don't judge people on what other people say about them. You know, somebody might say to me, oh, I don't like them, they're all right, X, Y, and Z, and I just say, well, you know what, they've always been all right to me and I take as I find.
Yeah.
So I think that was lucky. He was lucky in that sense. I mean, there was a little groupie of them that were gunning for him. and they were mostly white British women that voted Labour actually.
Wow.
But it was difficult for him. But again, whilst he was getting all this backlash, it was actually mainly through the press. People in real life, the people in our street, the people at work, they were all saying to him, we've got your back. We don't believe a word of this. We know you're not these people. We know this is rubbish. So yeah, but obviously he had a lot on his plate. He went from, I don't think he even knew our mortgages with till I got banged up. I sorted all that stuff out. He didn't do the bills and the shopping and the cooking and the cleaning. I did all of that. And so now he was left, as a one-parent family, holding 2 jobs down. His day job as an engineer is, you've witnessed yourself, it's not an easy job being a counsellor. If you're a good counsellor,
Yeah.
you put a lot of time and effort into it, It was a lot for him, a lot. And then I was really worried that, because he's got bone marrow failure, but he's currently in remission. So I was worried that all this stress and that was going to, make him ill again. And our daughter wasn't behaving the best, she was being a madam, and just everything. I just felt so awful for him. I think that they paid a bigger price than me, because it sounds really silly, but I did prison, I managed it, and I think I had, in some ways, an easier ride than they did, back home, dealing with everything, and all the legal stuff that he was, no one fought harder for me than him, and he was constantly, on the phone to solicitors and lawyers and looking at this and trying to get support and advice, and he did absolutely everything he could to get me out earlier at every opportunity. Unfortunately, it wasn't successful, but it certainly wasn't for lack of trying. Yeah, he did well. The boy did good, but it must have taken its toll on him. Like, he had an awful lot on his plate.
And what's it been like now since you've come back, and have you received a lot of support from people who because clearly, like, publicly wise, I feel like whenever I mention your case and I mention what exactly happened, every single person I've spoken to has said that is ridiculous. I literally had to tell your story so many times to my wife and explain to her that she went to prison. She just couldn't understand that this actually happened. So anyone I speak to just is always in support and just thinks this is crazy and whatever. How has it been for you with people around?
Yeah, again, in real life, in my friends, family, neighbours, they couldn't have been more supportive and lovely. I go to the supermarket and I get stopped by people who recognise me, and they literally fist pump me and say, thanks for taking one for the team, or we're so sorry for what happened to you. I had this lady come up to me in Waitrose not too long ago saying, it's just awful, I've got grandchildren and you've just spurred me on, I need to do more, I need to fight for our children. And when I first came out, it was really bizarre, because I'd kind of forget that maybe people would recognise me, and I'd be like in Next or whatever, and I'd be thinking, why are they looking? And they weren't looking at me in sideways or and then they'd come up to me and they'd give me their well wishes and their support, and it was lovely, especially at the beginning. I remember being in Costa Coffee. I'd only been out maybe a week and a half, and I was going to meet my friend for a coffee, and I sat in there waiting, and people were just like, saluting me almost at the till. And then this one guy comes over to me and he says, "Oh my gosh, Lucy," he says, "can I sit down with you and have a coffee?" And we were talking about everything. So, I mean, and then I recently, kind of just before Christmas, I went back on Twitter again. And, some of the abuse I get on there is absolutely horrific. The very people that are calling me out for what I said are saying way worse to me and my family and stuff. And I just think, do you not see the hypocrisy and the irony here? You don't have to like what I did. I'm not asking you to. I'm not asking you to agree with it. But abusing me on Twitter or coming for my children or my family, that makes you better than me, does it? And people are constantly ringing up probation. She said this, she did that, she's on this podcast and she said this, why is she allowed on this podcast? So the reality of it is, though, Twitter is not real. I think we can all get bogged down with social media and Twitter and
Yeah.
think, like you've just said, everybody in your walk of life, the majority of the people are not in agreement, you know, with me being sent to prison for a social
Yeah.
media post. If some days I would go on Twitter and I just think the whole world hates me. And I think we have to give ourselves a reality check sometimes and think, well, that actually isn't true, because never ever have I been out in public and I've had any negativity, ever. And that might be just that it's not that people aren't thinking that, they just don't come up to you in the street and, you know, start abusing you or attacking you. That's not what they do. Whereas on Twitter or Facebook, it seems to be like, well, we can say what we like because we're behind a keyboard. And my message to everybody actually would be, don't get sucked in by what you think people on social media think of you, because I do truly believe that the reality is very, very different. Like I said, in real life, I get a lot of support
Yeah.
and, you know, and offers of help and, you know, do you need a job, Lucy? Do you need this? Do you need that? Whereas, you know, on Twitter, I've got people, you'll never get a job. You'll never be able to work with children again. You're racist. You know, you're racist, fat. See you next Tuesday. And your daughter, I bet your daughter's so embarrassed to have a mother like you, which actually couldn't be far, you know, further from the truth. So, yeah, I do think we all need a reality check sometimes with social media. And we're all guilty of getting dragged into it and thinking, oh, is this really what people think? And no, I don't believe that actually that's what the majority of people think. But some days you would think so, given by the abuse that I get on social media.
I mean, I think I suppose one of the positive of X maybe in the last year or so since Elon Musk's bought it, that it feels more comfortable for. I think the abuse has always been there, but I think it almost feels a bit more comfortable to be supportive of other things that have changed. So, like for example, I'm not sure under previous X or previous Twitter ownership, I would have been so outrightly supportive of you, because I feel like that would have either been shadow banned or it wouldn't have reached the same, or I may have had my account just purely deactivated or something. Whereas now I have no fear in doing that, so I can just be like, oh, this is a disgrace or whatever, and it feels easy to. And that's one of the I think positives. But yeah, like you said, and I think I just feel like with yourself and what you've gone through, it's probably a lot of coordinated attacks as well. I wouldn't be surprised if it's people who deliberately want to make you feel like that the majority of people don't agree, because there's otherwise, like I said, I speak to quite a wide range, even more left leaning. Anyone I've spoken to, even on the left, would pretty much say that what happened in your case is just crazy. I don't think there's anyone I've met so far
I
who's
think anybody, any kind of normal person with common sense that doesn't base their whole life and every opinion on politics would agree. But like I said, you've got a small minority, well, I don't know if it is small anymore, that their whole life is ruled by, you know, politics. And, you know, it's like some kind of, I don't know, like, politics doesn't and shouldn't rule the world, does it?
yeah.
We are all more than who we vote for.
I mean, going back to the reform part, it's obviously clear. I'm just presuming with your husband being conservative counsellor, you've probably more right-leaning than left. And what has, I suppose, drawn you to reform? I mean, it's not just being in your circumstance with a conservative counsellor. There's so many people who are conservative minded who it's not that surprising, or I think there's so many conservatives that are now moving to reform. What for you has been the reason that you're as of now supporting reform?
Because, I mean, I would never vote Labour because I'm not a socialist, so it's not for me. I just feel so let down by the Conservative Party. I think, you know, we look at the situation we find ourselves in now, and realistically, we can't blame Labour for that because, you know, they've only been in for the last year. They've just exacerbated the situation and made it a whole lot worse instead of better, as they promised. I just feel really, really let down. I feel like they've let our children down. You know, we had years of austerity. Every it feels like nothing works in this country. And like I said, you can't blame Labour for that. You do have to put some of the blame onto the Conservatives. And for me, a big factor was COVID and lockdowns. I'm a
Yeah,
massive anti-lockdown person. I never
yeah,
advocated for lockdowns. I think they've literally ruined lives. I think life has changed massively from the COVID days and not for the better. And it's never quite returned to how it was. I'm not happy with any government telling me or any, regardless of whether I took the vaccine or not. I'm not happy with, it being forced upon somebody, or told you're going to lose your job if you don't take a vaccine, or you can go to McDonald's but you can't go and play a game of golf or a game of tennis. And people lost businesses,
yeah.
people hung themselves. I'm really, really unforgiving over the way COVID was handled as well. That's a big factor for me, and I will never forgive and forget. So any of these politicians that were all involved in that, they're never going to get my vote ever again,
Yeah.
because I just can't forgive the way they handled the COVID lockdowns.
Lockdown for me, I'm the exact same as you. I hated, I think apart from the first lockdown in March, the first 2 weeks where I still wasn't too happy, but I kind of thought, okay. But I remember by May, there was a really good professor, I always forget his name. He wrote about how in May 2020 was the lowest year on record for, lowest month on record for cancer. So it was the lowest month of people get that were being diagnosed with cancer. That's it, in May 2020. And I remember thinking that is absolutely horrible. People haven't stopped getting cancer, but they're so scared because of lockdowns,
They're
because
not
of the
going
way
to the
that
hospital.
they didn't want to go to the hospital, even though it's a virus, the COVID, we got 99 point whatever percentage chance of survival. And they were just so scared that they didn't go to the hospital, so they didn't get diagnosed. And the amount of people, which they never really will share, the amount of people who died from cancer the following years, the repercussion. And that's just obviously just one thing in particular, where I remember just seeing that one thing, it stuck with me. And then what really, probably similar to yourself, Lucy, I think one of the things that makes us more conservative is government shouldn't tell us what to do. Like, that's not what I've always been told. That's what the left do. That's what socialism does. That's not what a conservative is. That's like the anti. That's, we don't believe in that, and I think that really hurt a lot of people.
Yeah. I
Where,
think
sorry, carry on.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think people like being told, they must do this, they must do that. The government are supposed to be there to protect us and to help us. And, we haven't seen much evidence of that over, certainly over the last 15 years.
I mean, what's your experience been like with reform so far? I think I've seen you with reform people. How has the experience been so far for you?
Well, I voted Reform before it was fashionable.
All right. Okay.
Like I said, after the last election, the last election, I think I was obviously in prison for but the one before that, um, I would have ordinarily voted Conservative, and in fact, the MP was a friend of ours. He was a friend of my husband's, and he was a good MP. I can't fault him, but I just couldn't. I just could not bring myself to vote Conservative. I just felt like it went against every moral and piece of integrity that I have in my body. I just couldn't. I can't forgive them. So I voted Reform because, like I said, I was never going to vote Labour. So I've never disliked Nigel Farage. Before I had met him personally and stuff, he was never anyone that had done anything to offend me. So I had no reason not to. I just thought, well, let's give something else a go. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over, isn't it? And expecting a different result. And then obviously this all kicked off, and Reform were very much in support of me. Richard Tice came and visited me in prison. Nigel was very vocal, and a lot of their MPs were very vocal about how awful they thought this was, and how, I shouldn't have gone to prison, and sending messages of support and stuff, and supporting Ray in the background, as was Rupert Lowe. So there was no support from the Conservatives, no support from
Wow.
Labour. They just thought, So, and like I said earlier, all political parties are going to get things wrong sometimes, and we are never going to agree all of the time with it doesn't matter how, you know, well we think they're doing or how wonderful we think that party is. They are going to make calls and they are going to make decisions that at some point you do not agree with. But as adults, we should be able to talk about those and discuss those, and not, you know, demand that, you know, that person immediately, you know, stands down or loses their job or is cancelled or what have you. And for me, I will stand by the fact that I think, you know, we can't have another Conservative government. We definitely need this government out. So our last chance saloon to kind of to turn things around and fix the economy and give our children a chance is to give reform a chance. And that's obviously just my opinion. I know there's lots of people out there that won't agree with that. And what I noticed when I came out of prison, actually, which was quite funny, like it used to be a bit taboo for you to admit to, you know, oh, you know, it was a bit, you admitted to it, but not kind of maybe shouted about it, and you were careful who you told that you voted reform. That's just not the case now. You know,
Yeah.
the likes of Reform, the likes of Rupert Lowe, they've got massive public support. And when I went to the Reform conference, so it was I came out of prison mid-August. I went to the Reform conference the beginning of September. And I was there a day earlier in the hotel that they'd put us up in, and it was in like on at the NEC, and where the shops and the restaurants and hotels and stuff were. And we were eating dinner in a restaurant, and there was just all these people walking around with their Reform lanyards on. Like, they didn't care. They were walking around the shopping centre in Birmingham. They were sitting there eating their dinner, and they've got, you know, they're loud and proud, their Reform lanyards on. And I remember thinking, yes, because you shouldn't be ashamed of who you vote for. You have the right to vote for who you, and you shouldn't get attacked in public
Yeah.
because, you know, you vote Reform or you vote Conservative, whoever you might be. So there's definitely been a shift in the way the public are like, do you know what? We don't care. We vote Reform. We support Rupert. We don't care if you think we're far right. We've had enough. We have had enough of. It's almost like two fingers, I think, to the establishment as it is. We've had enough. We're gonna, you know, vote differently. We're gonna try something different. And, you know, it was a pleasant surprise to see all these people, you know, loudly, you know, saying I vote Reform. So I think there's definitely been a shift in public perception of the likes of Reform and people not caring. And you know, these words are thrown around so much now: fascist, racist,
Yep.
all of these things. They really have just lost their meaning. You know, if someone says to me I'm racist now, I go, yeah. You know, because there's no point in arguing with these people. I know what I am and what I'm not. So, and the people that know me and love me know I am and what I'm not, you know. So I'm fed up of trying to like reason with these people and justify myself to them now. I've apologised for what I've done many times. I did 12.4 months in prison, for Christ's sake. Would you like a kidney? Would you like me to donate an organ? What do you want from me? You know, these are the very same people wishing me to go back in prison that would ordinarily say they believe in the system and they believe in rehabilitation and, you know, they've done their time. You know, this is another thing. Irrelevant whether you believe I should or should not have gone to prison, I did go to prison and I have done my time. So why are you still, you know, poking the bear, so to speak? Why have you got such a massive issue with the fact that I'm out of prison? We let rapists out of prison earlier than they did me. We accidentally let, you know, people that aren't here legally out of prison. We let also we don't even send paedophiles to prison. But, you know, me, I should still be there.
We just know for a fact if the sentence was Lucy Connolly, the wife of a Labour councillor, the mentality of those same people would be completely different. If it said Green or whatever, I think the comments that they give you would be completely different.
Well, we've seen it with the Ricky Jones case, haven't we?
Yeah.
I mean, my stance on that is I'm glad the system worked as it should for him. Lucky him. If only it did for the rest of us. You know, he took the chance, he got his bail, he went not guilty, he got found not guilty. He's been acquitted. You can't keep going on about that forever, can you? He went to court, he got acquitted. It doesn't matter whether you feel that he should have done or he shouldn't have done. That's how it is.
Agreed. Lucy, it's been amazing speaking to you. We have a
Been a
final
pleasure.
ritual we always do on this show, which is I ask the guests for an unpopular opinion that they have that they think should be popular. So it could be anything we discussed already, it could be something completely random. But yeah, an unpopular opinion you have that you think should be popular.
Oh, I've got lots. Uh, Probably at the moment, the top for me is that the education system is massively failing our children and as good as indoctrinating them. Um, I just think the state school system is a terrible mess, and our poor kids.
I think that's a good one. I think plenty of people will agree with you there. Lucy, thank you so much for your time today. It's been awesome.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.